I'll retweet on Rex on X.
Yeah, what's the official word on that?
I think it's officially a post now,
Is
but
it?
the thing is, like, a post is so generic across all platforms
No
that I
kidding.
still like to call it tweets
Yeah, most
because
people
it was
do.
unique. It was the only one.
Yes, one thing Musk did, I don't understand why you rebranded it. You had the name, man. Everybody knew it.
Yeah.
Everybody said tweet, and you knew exactly what they meant.
Yeah.
Hey Lee, what's your handle on X exactly? It's Lee.
Lee Rob, but there's three E's
Ah, okay.
because such
Yeah.
is life. One day I will acquire the 2E version, just like LeeRob.com, which took me 10 years to finally get, but I got it.
Oh yeah.
Did you
Yeah.
talk somebody into selling it, or did they just finally give up renewing it?
They finally gave up, and guess what their name is? Rob Lee.
Oh,
So kind of the inverse. They finally gave up and didn't renew it, and I snagged it. So
good deal.
I'll take it.
Yeah. All right, so we're talking about Next. We're talking about Vercel. There was something else in that email. I gotta go.
Oh, we're
hunt it
talking
up.
He's
about
zero.
Next and Vercel. That's
Yeah, lots of good stuff
All
to
right.
talk about.
yeah.
Good deal.
It's amazing. Well, it's for the show, but it's pretty amazing for me that that such a small company is able to, well, relatively speaking, yeah, is able to
Mhm.
have such a huge impact on the web,
Mm.
on
Yeah,
web dev.
I do think that.
Yeah, but let's keep it for the show.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, I'll get us started then, since it sounds like we're ready to go. Hey,
do it.
folks, welcome back to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. This week on our panel, we have Steve Edwards.
You had to think about which one you were going to go to there for a second, didn't you?
Well, I didn't want to say Dad Joker,
Oh,
which
sorry.
is what my brain said.
Oh, well, that's what most people think. I'll do my AJ and say, yo, 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 coming at you live from cold and rainy Portland.
We also have Dan Shapir.
Hi from a freezy Tel Aviv at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 degrees Celsius, which is, literally freezing for us.
That's freezing. That's above where I'm at now in the middle of the day.
Yeah, I'm Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs, and yeah, it's 40 something degrees here,
Yeah.
and I went for a walk, so
Yeah, no, it's
all
warmed
a
up
matter
for
of
us,
perspective.
man. Yeah.
We also have Lee Robinson. Lee, welcome back.
It's good to be here. It's 58 degrees Fahrenheit here, which is like a sauna because it was negative Fahrenheit like last week. So I'll
Wow.
take it.
Yeah, I was going to
That's a
say I'm going
swing.
to come out there, but if you're getting negatives, forget it.
Yeah, that's classic Midwest. It's very cold.
Yeah. So it's been what, a year or so since we had you on. What's new?
A lot. There's lots we can talk about through Next.js, Vercel, V0, and AI. All sorts of fun stuff.
Yeah,
So it
I
sounds
would
like you're
say-
mostly doing the same kind of thing that you were doing last time.
Yes, definitely.
I was saying before we started that it's pretty amazing to me that such a small company, relatively speaking, of course, because you're a multi-billion-dollar company with a few hundred employees, but it's still relatively small, is able to have such a huge impact on web development. It seems like everything is kind of revolving around you these days in one way or another.
One thing that I think has worked well for us that Guillermo likes to call recursive founder mode, which I think is kind of funny. If you've seen all the discourse about founder mode, is trying to hire former founders or people who have that energy and then giving them ownership and agency over a domain and letting them kind of run with it. So a good example of this is just last week, we released a flags SDK for feature flags, an open source toolkit you can use to implement feature flags correctly in your app using the server, preventing layout shift with any feature flag provider that you want. And this is kind of a founder-led thing. We have Dominic, who is really owning this project from end to end. It's a very small team working on this, but small teams can do amazing things when empowered and given the right direction and resources.
For sure.
Yeah.
I'm
I
curious.
have to say,
Is
I
it based on
really
edge?
like that.
Oh,
Anyway,
sorry.
go ahead.
I was curious if it's based on edge computing.
So we do really recommend people to use the server in general, because most of the jank that you see in websites that have feature flags is because they wait for the initial document to get on the page, the first bundle of JS to load, and then they're evaluating what feature flags are on. And you get that weird shift of
Right.
maybe one experiment and then the other, or you also see this with authentication, like the logged out state, and then it switches to the logged in state. So
Right.
we are strongly pushing for server side experimentation, server side flagging. And to do that, generally you want to put your flags close to where your database is. So it's not necessarily that the flags need to live at the edge. Generally, they'd live at origin by your database, but you can still do some things early in the routing layer at the edge. Maybe that's redirects or rewrites. Maybe that's pre-computing multiple different variants of the page and putting the static shells of those pages at the edge, like in a CDN layer, so you can fetch those early. So it's kind of a bit of both. We want to use the edge layer for the static assets, and then put your data next to your compute at origin.
Yeah, what some people actually do to reduce shift in these scenarios when they use client side is to actually intentionally put render blocking scripts at the very top of the page, but that obviously comes at a very high cost for Core Web Vitals.
Totally. I think the biggest offender that I see is teams who don't realize that they're actually leaking all of their flags on the client side. They're using client-side experimentation,
yeah.
but if you inspect the DOM or you do some magic in your dev tools, you can actually see every single experiment or every single flag. And for the
that's not necessarily bad.
It's not necessarily bad, although sometimes I think maybe on a large enough team, the developer thinks that it is a secret value when in reality it is not, and they don't realize that they're actually exposing that to the client side. So it can be fine if you know what you're doing. I've just seen it misused a few times.
Don't put credentials in feature flags.
Yes, yes, definitely.
Don't put credentials in your source code at all.
Yeah.
One thing that I want to just touch on here, because I love the idea of kind of the internal entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say that when I've worked like contracts or full-time jobs, a lot of times it's we're going to give you features and then you're just going to implement them. And I really like that open feeling of, hey, we need this solution, go make it. Like that would kind of be, if I didn't want to take the entrepreneurial risk, that would be my ideal job.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, we like to think about empowering startups within a startup. So another good example of this is our product v0.dev, which allows you to very quickly build websites and web applications with AI, or just better understand how to use web tools like Next.js and React through AI. And that team is very small, and it's led by a former founder who really understands how to build great products and has been given, a budget, autonomy to build this product end to end and really monitor success and own their numbers. And it's working pretty well.
So since you did mention V0, and AI seems to be a fairly popular topic.
Yeah.
Not around here.
What?
Yeah.
What does AI stand for? I'm kidding.
Apple Intelligence, I think.
There you go. Yeah, that's right.
Anyway, what can you tell us about V0? I mean, I seen it. I played with it. It's really cool. But what can you tell us about it?
Yeah. So we've been working on V0 for over a year now. The first version that we released was kind of our first experimentation into the generative UI space, taking these new large language models at the time that were getting really, really good at being able to produce code and figure out how we could help them better craft the front end, do animations, do CSS. And over time, we've just been slowly adding more functionality. So V0 now supports building full stack applications. You can integrate through databases, through Vercel. You can add secrets or environment variables through Vercel to connect to any external services, maybe some AWS Q service you want to use. Could be really anything. And we've also launched a community that has published many different V0 generations that you can fork and get started with. So what once started as a very small tool to allow you to quickly build some UIs is now this kind of full featured prototyping and app building platform that allows devs to take an idea, whether it's something they want to build from a screenshot or a prompt or a pre-existing kind of template, take it, fork it, prompt it, turn it into something that they would like to build or they would like to use, and then deploy it to Vercel in just a couple clicks and have that thing actually live on the internet to share. And since we've been slowly adding more of these features, the growth trajectory of V0 has been, it's been really wild to see. Obviously, AI is very popular right now, and lots of people are interested in getting excited in how these tools can help them kind of level up their careers as developers. But I think more interestingly, bring in a whole new group of people into what it means to be a developer. It's less about writing the code for these people. It's more about they have great ideas and they now have tools that actually allow them to build those ideas. So think about, for example, the product marketers, the product managers, maybe some of the designers who don't have as much coding experience. A lot of them are being able to use tools like V0 and actually build and publish their ideas.
So I have a ton of
So-
questions about that. So first of
Yeah, me
all,
too.
do you want to start? Or
No,
should
go
I?
ahead.
Actually,
So first
Dan,
of
let
all,
me
go
interrupt
go
first.
ahead, Steve.
I'm gonna get in. So I don't worship at the React altar myself. I'm a Vue dev myself,
Yes.
and so I tend to work more with Vue and Laravel and Inertia and stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
I've heard Vercel talked a lot about, but I don't really know it, and I suspect there's a lot of people listening who might not know it as well. So before we dive any more into Dan's question, I was wondering if you could just give an overview on what Vercel is and who its target audience is, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Vercel is a developer cloud. So we're trying to give you, as a developer, all the tools you need to build websites and web applications, from hosting and managing your React or Vue or Svelte applications to having observability into your production infrastructure usage, integrating with databases or other backend services and other cloud providers or hyperscalers, bringing all of these tools into kind of one place that you can use as you put all your Lego bricks together to actually be able to build your amazing piece of art. And that's Vercel at a 50,000-foot view.
So now you just mentioned Vite, but I'm sorry, you mentioned Vue, but I'm looking at your supported frameworks docs, and I don't see Vue listed anywhere. I see Next and Svelte. I see Nuxt.
Mhm.
And
yeah,
Vite,
we support Nuxt is the primary way we see people deploying Vue applications to Vercel, but we also support doing a more traditional, just client-only Vue application as well. Generally, we like to recommend Nuxt. I think they're building something really great with the framework. But also, if you want to use a like Vite and Vue application, for example, that's also supported.
Okay.
So going back to V0, first of all, V0, V1.
Yeah, right. It's like, okay, as we continue to iterate on it, do we bump the version number? No, the naming, it's kind of funny.
Someone is going to go name squat that v1.dev.
Yeah. I didn't expect this to happen, but we've seen a lot of people have a play on the name of V0. So we saw an email zero. I think there's a YC company now doing A0 or something like that. So it's been fun to see other people take this idea of GenUI and apply it to other domains, emails, mobile apps, etc. But really the whole intention behind the name was you can get started here. It's not necessarily saying it's going to replace your production code. It's not going to, prevent the need from still writing a lot of code. It's helping you get started quickly in building something great.
By the way, there's Void Zero. That's Evan Yu's new company.
Yeah, it was funny. I think that name was after V0, but then it's pretty similarly named, which is kind of funny.
Yeah.
So the fact that it's V0 kind of, and also looking at the demos that you primarily show, it seems to indicate that what you're building is literally version 0 of a product.
Mm-hmm.
That it's taking either an idea, a concept, like you said, maybe an image or a screenshot. Does it also support Figma or something like that?
Yeah. You can paste in a Figma link and It can understand your design system colors and what's on the page, and then start building a UI from there.
Yeah, and basically it turns that into code that interactively replicates the design that you gave to it, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, and the big difference in the way to think about this versus a no code or a low code tool is generally with the previous generation of tools, kind of pre AI, was the code that you got out from the low code or no code tool was not necessarily production quality code. It was not code that was using the popular frameworks of the world that you could then take and kind of eject and actually start building your application into something that was a real app. It was more so like maybe just a big blob of HTML with some inline JS in there. It wasn't, using the ecosystem of the NPM libraries that we have today versus kind of rebuilding everything from scratch. And it wasn't also built on top of reusable, accessible component primitives, which is something that V0 does use, which is a component distribution system called ShadCN UI.
Yeah, I'm familiar, of course, with ShadCN.
Chat
My
CN.
ShadCN.
ShadCN.
It's a component library, UI component library, popular one, probably
Yeah,
the
it's
most popular one.
it has a unique approach because the traditional way of distributing component libraries, think about maybe Material UI is a very popular one, for example, from Google. They build these abstractions that are very good. They get published as NPM packages, and then you pull them down and you use them in your app. But what happens when you want to take that and kind of transform it to your own design system, your own brand? Well, you can extend them to an amount, but you don't control the code. You're using this abstraction through NPM, and you can't go in and actually modify the source code very easily. Of course, there's hacks, right? What ShadCN is trying to do is it's more of a component library distribution system, or a way for you to build your own component library. So it gives you all of the code. You can effectively copy paste it into your, into your editor, into your project, tweak all the tokens and the design system colors and install packages, delete packages. And then there's a nice CLI that helps you add new components as you need them.
I gotcha. I have to say, I went on there and I mashed the button for a landing page, and it gave me a next app. And then I clicked preview, and it said it couldn't load because I couldn't find the CSS file.
Oh, no.
I mean, the code looks good. It's just a little, but it's AI and it generates and sometimes misses things. I've seen.
Yeah. You should try is there a fix button in the bottom left? Ideally, if there's an error thrown, there'll be a little fix button, which is a good time to talk about the general philosophy of these tools. Part of the reason why we called it V0 too, with these non-deterministic AI systems, they're going to get things wrong, right? It's never going to be perfect. And
it's generative. It predicts the next word, or in this case, the next token of your code.
Yep.
And so it'll miss stuff. Yeah.
Totally. So one thing we've tried to do from the unbounded space of you can generate any code in the world to try to narrow that down into something that's predictably outputting consistent UI is we try to add a lot of systems and pieces in place to narrow in and improve the quality ratio. Because ideally, at the end of the day, as a consumer of this product, you want quality generations, both in the UI itself, but in getting working functional code. And the biggest lever that we've done to do that is really focusing in on our niche, which is React applications. That's the pipeline where we're reviewing and ensuring that the data that goes into the system is really high quality, and also reviewing the output if somebody has a bad time. So yeah, I'm curious if that works for you.
So a few questions about that. First of all, which model are you using?
There's a bunch, actually. Generally, you can think about it as a big decision tree, because the user puts in a prompt. That prompt, we first kind of have to classify what they were even trying to do. Were they trying to just ask a knowledge question? Were they wanting to generate some code? There's a lot of branches it can go down. And then even as it goes down the branches, we might want to flip between models on the fly, depending on the quality of one model, or maybe a new model comes out. I think the new Claude model was just released today, for example. So we try to make this system that helps us get the best quality output. And then we abstract away everything else in the middle and just focus on having really high quality data in and evals or tests to ensure that the quality is predictable.
Or you could use DeepSeek if you don't mind a bit of Chinese propaganda on your page.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, maybe, but you can also run DeepSeek. I think
Yeah.
it's the unbiased on like Olama or something, and then
Mhm.
you don't have all the filters in front of it. I mean, they still trained it on their own data, and so if you
Right.
ask it questions about
yeah, it can
Chinese
still,
history that are
yeah.
inconvenient, it just doesn't give you a correct answer because it
Right.
has no idea. But
I think
yeah,
a lot
it
of the enforcement was
DeepSeek's cool.
coming at the like inference time compute. The test time compute was where they were doing a lot of the cloud hosted version of DeepSeek was where they were doing a lot of the biasing towards the answers that they didn't want to answer. So the open source
Mhm.
models, definitely in the training data, they are still biased in a certain direction, but you can get better results by doing it that way.
Yeah,
Which I've already seen a few
they are.
models on Hugging Face, and I think there's like a Llama distilled version as well.
So
Yeah,
is
I've played with DeepSeek and I've played with some of the other ones, and it is really, it's really good in a lot of areas. So
so the name V0 seems to indicate that the focus on the product is on the initial generation and less so about taking an existing app and modifying it or adding capabilities into it. Is that correct, or is that just my interpretation?
That was definitely where we got started. As we've added more functionality to the product, we're now getting to a point where, in the future, you'll be able to connect to a Git repo and bring in the code you already have in your application and make changes from there. So I think in the
oh,
future,
interesting.
V0 will evolve to be more of your general purpose AI assistant that you can use for many different things. We're just trying to incrementally get there as we tackle one problem and hopefully do it well before kind of moving on and expanding scope.
So if that's the case, how is it different from something like Cursor or Copilot or
Mhm.
something like that?
Yeah, totally. I think of Cursor and Windsurf and some of the AI enabled IDEs as tools for, I'll call them professional programmers or professional coders, who are primarily, in their IDE, in their editor all day. They're fantastic at that. And I use Zed personally, which also has AI tools, but they're all incredibly good at this. Versus, I think the market for V0 and other tools doing more of the generative UI space is more so, I think, for the kind of adjacent folks who are now getting into development. Certainly, obviously, I'm a professional programmer and I still use V0, but I've seen a lot of people either learning to build products through V0, or maybe they had an idea and they weren't really sure how to build it yet, all using V0 as a starting point to kind of kick off that knowledge, where it's more about the design and the ideas and the product experience than it is just the code itself. And of course, you can still view the code. It's still important that you can observe the code and modify the code. But first and foremost is the actual thing that you're building, which is kind of just a different model than the professional programmers, the IDEs, just a different model.
So I'll challenge you a bit about this if you don't mind.
Sure.
I've been told that I sometimes ask tough questions, and hopefully you're fine with it.
Yeah.
Um,
He's mean to
if
us too. It's okay.
if that's the case, if that's your target audience, the way that you're presenting it, isn't React potentially too low of a level of abstraction?
Hmm.
Um, because if I'm more of a design person, it's
Hmm.
great that I can give my code to a developer later on,
Hmm.
but if I'm playing with it, maybe I would like to play with, you know, at the higher level of abstraction with more sophisticated box, but less complicated boxes.
Hmm. Yeah. So while we do use React, the default for V0 generally is going to be a Next.js application. So it is a higher level abstraction on the underlying React primitives. Generally, though, the reason why I think React is a good fit for this type of model is when people are getting started with building their first application and they don't have a lot of experience, the mental model of components actually makes a lot of sense to people, more so than a vanilla HTML or vanilla JavaScript file. Like if we go back to jQuery days and you have a 1,000 line jQuery file, this is totally fine and it totally works. But looking at specific query selectors or looking up an element by ID and then swapping out, the data from there, the styling from there isn't as intuitive for the first time user, I think, as looking at some React code. Maybe not at first, but I think you pick it up a little bit more conceptually as you kind of get into the code a bit. At least that's been my experience talking with folks who are kind of learning or looking at React code for the first time. And secondly, the nice thing about the component model and composition of React is an LLM generates a bunch of stuff. Maybe there's 10 different files, 15 different files. You want to be able to place those into different, spots in your application without there being these global side effects. And that's one really nice thing that the React model does pretty well. Now, I will say, if you are a little bit more, maybe not super beginner, but maybe intermediate, and you kind of know a little bit, that you want to just work with HTML and vanilla JavaScript, you can explicitly prompt V0 to say like, hey, I know what I'm doing here. Like, give me more of that low level primitive, and I can kind of build from there.
Cool.
I want to jump in here too
just one
with
more thing,
some
Chuck.
of this. Oh, go ahead.
Will it be able to also generate, let's say, stuff for Svelte?
Yeah, I think right now it can answer Svelte questions, and it can help you build Svelte applications. In terms of the completely dynamic running of Svelte applications in the browser, we don't have support for that yet, but I would like to get there in the future for sure. It kind of goes back to that quality of the unbounded space of next token prediction is already tough enough. So we're trying to slowly, build a system that helps us get predictable, repeatable success, and then we can consider expanding out further.
Yeah, just related to that. So I told it what my error was in here, and it just gave me a global CSS. But then the next thing I did is I said, can you give this to me as a Nuxt app instead of a Next app? And of course, then what it did is it gave me a Nuxt app with the source folder for the Next app still in it. And so you figure this stuff out with your prompt engineering and things. But I think it's just fascinating how far you can get. And I've done this with other projects with AI, where I've essentially said, okay, give me an app, this kind of an app, with ChatGPT or some of the other ones. Give me this kind of an app with these kind of features and these kinds of, deals. And I'm using Tailwind and it'll do it. And then if I go and run it, I can come back and tell it I got this error, and it will generally fix it within one go. Sometimes it can't quite figure it out, and that's that makes me feel good because I'm never gonna not be able to get a job as a programmer. But yeah, it's pretty interesting to see how far you can get on this stuff. And yeah.
How maintainable is the code that it generates?
How maintainable is the code?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is one of the biggest advantages, in my opinion, of building on foundations like existing popular open source frameworks, is that you're ejecting the code out into a system that is an open standard. It can be deployed to any infrastructure in the world, whether it's a S3 bucket or deployed to something like Vercel. And there's this thriving community of developers who are, consistently with every release making the docs a little bit better, making the examples a little bit better, building all these templates in the community, fixing bugs, making improvements. And it has the backing of a decently sized staff team in the Next.js team who is helping make it better every day.
Yep. I did run into a rate limit. I asked it too many questions, and then it said, you have to sign up for Vercel to keep using it.
Yeah, sign up. No, $20 a month more. No. Yeah.
No, I've used Vercel in the past, and I like it.
Nice.
Good things going on there.
I saw a relatively new capability in it. I'm guessing that you can select a component and ask it to modify just that component.
Yep.
Correct? That's a relatively new feature, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I think the next step would be to add some sort of drag and drop capabilities or something.
Yeah, we'd love to find a good way to, bridge the gap of a little more visual editing, tooling that helps you think about the UI from a higher level of abstraction versus just prompting. Of course, you can get very far with prompting, but sometimes you like the tools that, things like a Figma might have. There's some pretty helpful stuff in there.
Yeah. Okay, so anything else you want to say about V0 before moving on to the next one?
Yeah,
You've got
one
a
thing that I
whole
wanted
bunch
to,
of tools.
yeah, I just wanted to jump in on V0. So it's targeted at people who maybe don't have a ton of coding experience, or, I could see this. It gave me a nice enough layout on the thing that I clicked on that I could see this as just kind of a, hey, this is a kickoff point for me, and I'm competent at this stuff.
Mhm.
Are you seeing this as something that could conceivably become a proper dev tool, or are
Mhm.
you looking to go in that direction with something else, or where do you land on that?
Yeah, at least for me and my experience, I already consider it a proper dev tool. It's something that I use to build a lot of applications that or ideas that I have that maybe I want to almost run in parallel. Like you can try out a couple different
Mhm.
ideas and like, okay, I like this version better. I'm going to prompt this one and go a little bit further. I recently wrote a blog post about this called personal software. I think other people have called it vibe coding, which I like the name of. Basically, it's not necessarily saying this is production software used by the government, but there's lots of software and applications to be built, and it can be very fun to do it in that way. So I think we're
Mhm.
seeing a lot of adoption for those type of use cases. The only other thing I'll mention on V0 is if you're really curious about how it's built, everything that powers V0, we have open sourced a ChatGPT like application doing very similar things. So it's kind of build your own ChatGPT chatbot that can generate code and run code in the browser. It can generate spreadsheets and create images and have the canvas or artifacts like features that Claude and ChatGPT have. And that's part of our AI SDK, which is another framework that we maintain. It's like lower level primitives to help you build AI
Mhm.
applications. So chat.vercel.ai is that template if you want to try it out. And it's all open source, so you can fork it and build your own.
Awesome.
I just want to mention that my connection has become a bit spotty all of a sudden. So if I drop off or anything, that's hopefully that won't happen. But
No worries.
If it happens, then people will miss you because I'll ask all my dumb questions.
So anything else about V0?
No, I think that's the majority of it. If you haven't given it a shot, please do. I'd love to hear feedback for anybody listening. Feel free to shoot me a message.
Nice.
So of course, I think Vercel is best known for Next.js, I think.
Mhm.
Although it's important to note that Vercel and Next.js are not the same thing.
Mhm.
Um, so maybe that's actually something worth talking about, like the relationship between Vercel and Next.js.
Yeah. Yeah. So going back to 2016, kind of a ways away, um, when Vercel was getting started, Guillermo was trying to build a really high quality front end, a really high quality application. And at the time wasn't very satisfied with the state of tooling and like, every engineer, well, rather than building my product, I'm going to build the tooling for the product instead. And he spent, a decent chunk of time building out what was, the first version of Next.js back in 2016. And the idea at the time was putting together a React application is kind of hard, and he wanted to build a server first or a server side rendered React framework that would make that easy to create, application UI, marketing pages, dashboards, e-commerce sites, and so on. And this was really about the same time that Create React app came out, so only a few months apart.
Mhm.
And they've both kind of served unique purposes over the years. Since then, Next.js has grown to add a lot more functionality. The community has grown to be a React framework that can build pretty much any type of application. If you want to build an interactive dashboard, like some kind of single page app, that's totally doable. If you want to build, SEO optimized marketing pages or logged out e-commerce experiences, that's also possible. If you want to build new AI chatbots where you can stream in responses from the server, that's another prominent use case of Next.js. So it all kind of sits on the foundation of React as the UI rendering layer, the UI engine for your components. And then we add some niceties in the middle to simplify working with images and optimizing fonts and optimizing third-party scripts and streaming content from the server and building out your API layer and so on and so forth. So going back to your original question on the relationship, over the years, we've just continuously been investing in this MIT licensed open source framework to a point now where we have 1.3 million monthly active developers on Next.js. And I think we're at 8.5 million weekly downloads on NPM. So really the trajectory has been great for folks picking up and adopting and putting Next.js in production for both, personal sites, small startups, and really large enterprises. Vercel
Wait a
helps
minute, I
maintain.
would just like to interject there. An interesting statistic that I saw. So there's the Google Crux database. Are you familiar with it?
Yes.
So they mostly it's used for looking at the performance of production websites that Google scans.
Mhm.
But it also analyzes the technologies with which those sites are constructed. So you can actually ask it, show me the performance of all the React sites, or show me the overall performance of all the Vue sites, and so forth. But you can also just basically ask it a simple question like, how many sites do you see that use React? How many sites do you see that use Next? And it seems to me, looking at the numbers, it seems to me that if you're building a new website using React, it's probably being built with Next.
Yeah.
Uh, because looking at this again at the statistics from 2022 up till now, the numbers seem to indicate at that period of time, React websites that Crux analyzes have grown by something like 10%, but the Next.js websites have like tripled or
Yeah.
something along these lines. So
Mhm.
effectively, it means that if you're building a React website, then it's probably being built with Next.js.
Mhm.
Does that kind of match what you're saying?
So the last time I checked out the HTTP archive data, which backs the Crux report, was in December of last year of 2024. And at the time, there were 28,000 of the top million sites that were using Next.js, which is pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. And of those 28,000, 50% of them were using the new routing system inside of Next.js called the App Router, which under the hood uses some of these new React features like React Server Components and Server Actions, and some of the lower level things like streaming that overall help get better core web vitals. So it's been awesome to see on two fronts. One, just the general adoption of folks building React sites. Two, those who are choosing to pick Next.js as their React framework of choice. But then three, those who are now starting to build with the app router or incrementally migrating over to the app router are generally seeing better core web vitals across pretty much all dimensions versus kind of the previous model of Next.js that still exists, but we're kind of investing in this on-ramp over time for people to take better advantage of the server for some things and better advantage of the client for other things. So
So
yeah, I think that lines up.
HTTP Archive actually identifies websites that use the new app router.
Yeah. Yeah. By
Oh,
looking at
that,
the different tags in the body.
oh, that's cool. I didn't know that. I knew
Yeah.
that it identifies Next.js. I didn't know that it actually is able to distinguish between the page router and the app router.
Mhm.
That's really cool. But conversely, what I'm also saying, so about, well, over half a year ago, I switched jobs, and while I was, hunting for a new position, I was I was speaking with various companies, and also because of the type of position that I was looking for, I was also kind of looking at the technology stacks that they were using and whatnot. And what I saw was that again, it's anecdotal, but it was still fairly, consistent, let's call it. It seemed that indeed, if you're building a website using React, then you're highly, and by website I mean something that Google would likely rank or scan. Then it's highly likely that you're using Next.js. But a lot of organizations that are building web apps, they're a lot of times still predominantly client side only in terms of their React usage.
Mhm.
And then they're kind of not using React or any other kind of full stack framework. And they're like mostly just doing React on the client side and using not necessarily even JavaScript on the back end. They might be talking directly to, RESTful endpoints implemented in whatever.
Yep.
Uh, so, are you thinking about somehow addressing that market as well?
Yeah, totally. I think our story today is maybe under discussed, but we have a pretty strong story for building single page applications in Next.js, or kind of fully client applications. Most of the time, obviously, I talk a lot about the server stuff because I'm particularly excited about making it easier for developers to use features on the server. But for a lot of apps, especially, I don't know, an internal dashboard at some very large company where they've already got an established, you know, it's probably not even a Node backend. Maybe it's a Go backend or Java or something else. They've got a RESTful API somewhere. And their infra team hands them down this opportunity. You can deploy a site to S3, right? You can't run a server, but you can put some static files here. And doing that, their only option basically is to do a client-only application. And we want to make Next.js a great opportunity for those folks who are wanting to use React as well. So we have inside of Next.js this thing called a static export, basically, where you can tell the app, basically strip away the Node.js server. I just want to generate a bundle of HTML, JavaScript, CSS files,
Hmm.
and then I can drop them in an S3 bucket and just kind of be on with my day. And even further, if I want to basically opt into 100% rendering in the browser, 100% client-side rendering, we have a way you can basically skip server-side rendering entirely, which for some teams, they're like, yeah, like I know it's maybe not the best UX. I know that maybe it's a little bit slower, but it's fine. Like I'm just building something that has a bunch of heavy charting libraries and I just want to go straight to client only. And that can be okay too.
So you're basically saying that you can SSG static site generation into an S3 bucket, and you can take it a step further and basically SSG a blank page into an S3 bucket.
Totally. Yeah. The way I think about it is there is a strict SPA, which I'll define, strict single page application, which is basically that blank HTML shell that boots up some client JS. There's a ton of websites built this way, right? Like a lot of the client React only apps are just built this way. And that's fine. You can do that in Next.js. What we tried to do is build this gradual ramp. So you can do that. You can also pre-statically generate or pre-render more of that page. So it's not necessarily a blank HTML page, but like a good chunk of the shell that then boots up React on the client. Taking another step further, you can pre-render multiple inputs. So maybe you have the slash route, maybe you have slash dashboard, maybe you have slash users. Each one of them has a different shell. So you're not looking at the page loads, you see one spinner while you're waiting for the client JS to boot up, and then you've kind of loaded your client app. You can still get a little bit better UX by loading those shells and having different shells. And that's like 3 steps along this journey, but there's actually 5 more steps if you want to take it. Like if you decide, actually, I am okay with doing a little bit of stuff on the server, you can even run what's sometimes called a backend for front end, but you can use the Next.js server just to effectively, have your secrets to talk to your API, have your bearer token, and still have your REST API somewhere else. So you don't have to do some kind of wild proxy situation. It's basically just a proxy at that point.
Interesting. It's especially interesting given that the React core team is effectively retired Create React app.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think from their perspective, which makes a lot of sense, going back in time when Create React app came out, like I mentioned, it was basically the exact same time as Next.js. And the state of building a React app was way more difficult than it is today. Today, there's this vibrant ecosystem of frameworks and even lower level tools like bundlers who are building deeper integration into all of the bits of React. And I think for devs getting started, it's just dramatically easier to be productive right away. But to have a great UX, and it's kind of why I mentioned there's like this graduation curve. Yes, you can start here in the strict SPA mode, but like along the way, you're probably going to want some of these things. Like you probably want to have that little bit better UX so you don't have to stare at that loading spinner while the user's loading the page. And you know what? It'd be kind of great if I could prefetch some of that stuff on the server ahead of time rather than having to wait for the client and like offloading all of that work into the client. So it's kind of like, we know based on, you know, let's call it 10 years of React, you're probably going to run into like these 3 or 4 things and how you do routing, how you do data fetching, how you load your assets. So that's kind of why Next.js gives you all the building blocks for that. But then it's up to you, and you get the choice as the developer on how much or how little you want to use. If you want to use Next.js just as easy mode React that's all client rendered, like that's fine too.
It's interesting or amusing that it's basically you guys and then everybody else using Vite.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Vite has been a great tool for those people who want to kind of build their own type of system. So maybe they want to do, you know, they pick their own bundler. In Vite, they pick their own router, maybe a React router. They pick their own other pieces of the puzzle, a data fetching solution. Maybe they're using something like a React query, for example, and they can kind of put those pieces together based on whatever the needs are for their app. That's totally fine. And I still see a ton of people doing that. What we've tried to do with Next.js is provide another option, which is like, if you want to have all of that baked into the framework itself, that's one solution that we offer. But yeah, it's totally fine. I think it's a let 1,000 flowers bloom type situation where it's not a bad thing to have a lot of options in the ecosystem. I think this is primarily why React is still so popular 10 years later.
But is it really that way? Because it does seem that a lot of the React core team has moved from Meta into Vercel to the extent that it almost seems like the next version of React is Next.js. So is it a kind of world where Next.js is kind of eating React?
That's not really how I see it, because if you look at the percentage of the people who work and contribute to React that work at Vercel, it's still pretty small in comparison to the broader scope of the React team. I think a lot of people don't know the extent of how big the React team is at Meta. They do a lot of fantastic work, not only for the React core team itself, but for React Native and for supporting all of the React development for other kind of pieces of the ecosystem at Meta. Vercel certainly is helping push React forward insofar as we're contributing some of the server features, things that we're helping with, like server actions, for example. We've played a decent chunk in contributing a lot of that work. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's still a partnership between Meta and us, and hopefully more companies in the future as well. Like, I think from the React team's perspective, they would love to have more kind of full-time contributors to help build this out. But it's a pretty big investment in terms of your company's R&D spend. And it's something that, you know, Vercel is kind of motivated to do, because we also are trying to make Next.js a great framework that builds on top of React. So we're willing to invest the capital in terms of funding people on our team to help contribute to the core library. So yeah, that's the way I think about it. I think it's great that we help contribute to React, and I would love to see other companies join as well.
Cool. I like that approach.
So are there new innovations in Next.js that you want to tell us about, or things that are coming up that people might want to hear about?
Yeah, I think for me, the whole journey of 2025 it's basically 2 things. The first one is continuing to make 1% iterations every release, every day on the foundations, the fundamentals. Really great stack traces, really great error overlays that are beautiful and they help you find the answer quickly. Really great performance when you're working locally, fast compilation, fast hot module reload, fast builds. A lot of the things that are the bread and butter of the framework per se, maybe not the most sexy features in the world, but we think that performance and stability is a really important piece of what people who have signed up to use Next.js in their company appreciate in terms of frequent updates and improvements. So that's a heavy focus for us. Then the next release of Next.js here in a few weeks probably, or maybe shorter, we have a new redesigned error overlay that looks so great. It's got better stack traces. It's easier to find the information. It's got some nice animations, like just the little delights of polish that make the everyday experience of working in the framework better. So there's a ton of stuff in that category. And then the second category is, how do we take years of feedback on the framework and kind of continuously innovate and simplify the existing model along the way, while still respecting that, a lot of people are building their apps in a certain way and we don't want to disrupt their workflows, but we want to give them a solution over time that's increasingly more simple for them to adopt, especially for new people who are just getting started in the framework. So an example of this is in two ways: one around caching and two around the story with data fetching. So probably the biggest piece of feedback on Next.js for the past couple of years is very powerful that it has caching, but would love to see the default experience be a little bit easier. It's like, it felt like the ramp from, okay, I can do caching, to like, oh yeah, this is why caching is really hard, was like happening too quickly. So we've been working on an improved system that allows you to define directives, so like a string, like use cache, and cache a function or cache a React component in a much more granular, composable way. That's going to be coming here very soon. Then the next piece that builds on top of that is the ability to write code that looks asynchronous and have it actually be a page that's dynamically rendered. So I'll give you an example. You have a React server component. You might think, okay, that server component requires a server. The first misconception there is you can take a server component and you can do that static export I mentioned and run it as a pre-rendered component that just spits out some HTML, right? So it's kind of like a
build time, effectively.
Yeah, it's like a React build time component. It has the access to the server. So you've got the server component. You say async function, await, get data from database. If you write a call like await, get data from database, you're probably expecting that to be fresh data. Like you're making a call and you didn't say that you wanted anything to be cached, right? But the inherent confusion here comes with this idea of pre-rendering. If it's running during the build, you're trying to pre-render as much of the page as possible. And that's really good because you can get that fast initial response when you have the pre-render. So the two kind of pieces in parallel in this next phase are, if I write code that looks dynamic, the page should default to being dynamic. And then me as a developer, I get the opportunity to say, which way do I want to go? Should this be fresh on every request? Okay, great. I put suspense around it, React suspense. If it's not, and it's something I want to pre-render, I put use cache on it. So you have these like two paths of which way you want to take. And those three things, the first two, and then the third one being partial pre-rendering, which is effectively just a way to get a larger amount of the page pre-rendered, I think will simplify the experience of making Next.js apps quite a bit. So I'm looking forward to that future as well.
It's interesting. Well, of course, you know that they say that there are two hard problems in computer science.
Exactly.
It's naming things, cache invalidation, and off by one errors.
Yep.
Yeah, caching is hard. The need for caching, by the way, I mean, it's worthwhile to touch a little bit about why all this discussion about caching. I think it has to do with the fact that we're encapsulating data access, and that can really easily lead to waterfalls. And so one way is to basically, obviously, just break encapsulation and get all the data as efficiently as possible yourself and stream it into the components, but then the components aren't self-contained. So the alternative is to say, I will get the data at the component level, but I'm really smart about caching to avoid getting the same data multiple times and making all the data retrieval as efficient as possible. And that's the route that you guys seem to be taking. It will be very interesting to see how efficient how we are able to achieve this combination of efficiency, ease of use, and correctness. It's not going to be a trivial combination.
Yeah, just to your point on like why caching, the cache exists somewhere in the system. If it's not in your front end, then you're caching your API responses, or you have some like a in-memory cache in front of your database. Like most of the time, there's a cache somewhere in the stack. And I think what we're seeing with a Next.js app router app and being more involved across the full stack, basically React having more of an opinion about the network layer, is that those caches are moving into more user code that a developer, a product developer is having to think about, which is very powerful, but it's maybe not something they had to consider previously. Because like, well, that was some other team who worked on the REST API. They added the caching layer. I just hit that endpoint as much as I want. I don't really have to think about it. Like you could still build that model in an Next.js
Until
app if you want.
smoke comes out of the back of the computer.
Right, right. Or until your cache expires and you didn't realize that your cache control headers were misconfigured, and then actually you overloaded your database and you didn't have the proper stale with error caching headers. So now your page is down and you have to do a rollback. And there's a lot of hard parts in getting that right for sure. And building it into the system, like you said, while still maintaining correctness is tough. One of the things with Use Cache, because we can use the compiler, which shout out to Svelte, who does a great job of using the compiler as well, making that kind of a core part of the design of both the language and the framework with SvelteKit, is that we can look at the inputs into the function, the actual variables being used inside of the code where you've marked it with this directive, and automatically figure out the cache keys. So you don't, oh shoot, I forgot to mark this as a cache key for something that actually changes, so I'm not able to automatically invalidate that cache when it changes. Like a lot of those really hard things, we can automate some of that away by using the compiler. It's obviously not perfect. There are still cases where you have to be aware of what you're doing with the cache and tag it correctly and validate it correctly. But more and more of that we can build into the framework itself, the more little edge cases that you don't have to deal with.
Yeah, at this point, it's worthwhile mentioning that we actually had Joe Savona and Satya from Meta to talk about React Compiler, which is all about memoization, which is another way of saying caching. So for sure, I'm totally with you on that. Um,
I wanted to point out one other thing, and that is that you're talking about kind of figuring these things out as you go, and I think sometimes we kind of take for granted that things are just going to work without recognizing that sometimes the first pass is not great, or at least not ideal, and so just keep that in mind when you give the feedback. Right, it's like, hey, look, you've got some great tools here, and we're going to give you better tools, based on your feedback and things like that.
Yeah, I think in an ideal world, right, you would never ship and you would just cook away in private until you had the perfect API. And oh man, it was just the best thing in the world. People are going to love this. And I'm just going to keep waiting until I get it just right. And the reality is, like, it's a lot more messy than that.
Really sounds nice too.
Yeah,
well,
it sounds great.
my dad likes to say that the worst enemy of good is better.
Yeah. The enemy of done is perfection.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's true.
I am amused though that I'm still old enough to remember that the big selling point of JavaScript that it wasn't compiled. So it's really interesting to see how much of modern web development is actually based on bundlers and compilers. What you can think about bundlers as the modern day linkers. The fact that we are effectively compiling and linking the JavaScript code to get it to work the way that we need it to work.
Yeah, I love the ambition. I think there's a lot of push in the web development community, especially those who've been programming for a while. Like, can we get back to the roots of a compiler-free, bundler-free experience? And I love the ambition of that. I think yeah, I think there's good ideas there. I like the pragmatism of it. I think the reality is, where do you want to make the trade-off? And unfortunately, the trade-off with that approach usually comes at the user experience. And that's like a trade-off that I'm not usually willing to make, because I'd rather have a compiler automate a lot of that work for me. But you have to revisit your priors and recheck it year over year as technology continues to get better and better. So I agree spiritually with some of what he's saying, but I disagree on the effectiveness of compilers and bundlers in 2025.
Yeah,
I have to say, just kind of coming from the other side of this to maybe a stronger degree, there's a lot of it depends in there, right? If you're doing some things, maybe you don't need it, and then in other cases it makes a lot of sense. And so you have to look at it. You have to look at your approach. You have to look at what you're using, what your tools are, what your framework expects of you. And then I don't know that there's necessarily a right way or a wrong way. A lot of times it's just, this makes a lot more sense here and that makes a lot more sense there.
Yeah, it's about the trade-offs, really. I mean, if you can look at the extreme other direction as expressed by somebody like Alex Russell, So for sure, it really depends on what you're trying to build, the functionality that you're trying to ship, and whatnot. I mean, obviously, the fastest website is going to be the blank page. So it really depends on what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
Um, um, by the way, I saw another thing that might be worth mentioning in the short time that we have left that you guys, I think, recently introduced, which is something called Fluid. Can you say something about that?
Yeah. So a quick kind of, well, I'll try to make it quick. A little history on Vercel's computing. Back in the day, I'm sure you're probably familiar, but back in the day, we offered a server full platform where you could deploy Docker containers. This was many, many years ago. Um, and in some instances, like that's really great. You can have a lot of flexibility with what you bring to the platform. It's unbounded. You can do anything as long as you can get it into Docker. It's harder though to get a consistently good time because again, it can be literally anything. This is back in the day, kind of pre-Vercel moving to a serverless model. Along the way, we kind of found our footing, I think, with focusing on frameworks and focusing on being able to automatically define and generate the infrastructure as an output of the framework. So we call this framework defined infrastructure. Basically, it means you take a Next.js or Nuxt or SvelteKit or whatever framework you want to use, you write code in the open source way, you bring it to Vercel, and Vercel looks at the output of the build process. So you run next build and you get a bunch of files. And we do the work to actually convert that into cloud infrastructure. We turn it into distributing those files to a CDN or running the on-demand compute through Vercel functions and so on and so forth. So for many years now, we've been doing serverless compute on top of AWS Lambda. And that also has a lot of benefits, but also some notable downsides. I think the biggest downsides that we've faced over the years, number one, I think serverless as a term has become increasingly unhelpful because it means everything to everyone.
True.
And it's just like,
Cloud.
yeah, it is basically cloud, right? It's like, okay, so what exactly do you mean by that? Do you mean auto scaling? Do you mean cost effective? Like what are the more specific things that you mean? So I've increasingly struggled to explain what I'm talking about when I say serverless. The second and like the product feature that was the most damning or hard with Lambda is for every one request to my Node.js Lambda, I can only use one function. So it doesn't have the multi-concurrency of what you can get out of a server. You can send many requests into one box. Generally, that means it's going to be a lot less efficient with your actual infrastructure usage. One request to one function versus load balancing in many different requests into a box, effectively a server. That ultimately ends up saving customers a lot of money when you can be more efficient with how you route the compute. So over the years, we had these kind of warts of serverless that we were trying to fix and paper over. We would add new functionality to add streaming to Vercel functions. We would add new functionality to prevent unbounded recursions that could rack up denial of wallets. We would add functionality in to run very long workloads on top of functions. And then the latest things here is actually optimizing the lower level bits. So like the underlying infrastructure on top of the function, we rewrote it in Rust to make it very optimized, which, of course, just rewrite it in Rust and makes it faster, right? No, but we've really been optimizing every part of the stack to where now the last piece was making it much more concurrent. And we've now taken all of this and kind of bundled it into a new computing model that we're calling Fluid Compute. It's not necessarily something that is Vercel only. We think you could, build your own version of this on cloud primitives if you would prefer. But generally, it's trying to be a hybrid of servers and serverless, building off of our experience, what some other people in the industry have done, a lot of inspiration from things like Google Cloud Run, for example, which is kind of coming at this from the opposite side, from the server side and having auto scaling servers with the general goal of being, it's very cost effective. So if I'm doing a bunch of network IO to a database or to an AI model, I don't want to have to spend a bunch of extra money while I'm just waiting on all that network IO, which for a lot of apps, that's kind of the predominant usage of your compute. It's just talking back and forth. It's not the actual CPU time. So very cost efficient. very fast to start up and scale down. So it auto scales based on your traffic, which I think is really important. And ideally, you can eliminate this cold start problem that has plagued serverless for a very long time. And we do that by keeping a pre-warmed functions, which is basically like Google Cloud runs minimum active instances 1. It's like you always have compute running that you can load, balance, and send requests into. So all of that is Fluid Compute, and it's something that Vercel customers can opt into using today. And we've seen some pretty awesome results from it.
So it's kind of like Lambda functions, but they can live longer and service multiple requests and don't have to immediately shut down when they're done. Am I missing something?
Yeah, totally. And if you're doing network IO, you're being charged for the CPU, right? You can be a lot more efficient when you're waiting on a bunch of calls to your AI model or to your database, which ultimately drives down costs for very concurrent applications that are doing a lot of IO. So in some instances, we've seen people saving as much as 85% of their bill previously on the serverless model. It obviously depends on your traffic patterns, how concurrent your traffic actually is, but in almost all cases, it's better for the customer.
You said this isn't running on Lambda or things like that. What is it running on? Is this your own platform or?
Yeah, so we still use AWS,
okay.
But over the years we've had to, excuse me, over the years we've had to kind of build our own custom pieces to handle support before Lambda eventually had it, and in some instances never had it. So, for example, excuse me, one sec. Got a cough. For example, Lambda didn't have streaming until recently, I think maybe like a year ago. But when we launched the Next.js app router, we wanted to have streaming and had to build that kind of independently on our system. So we still use AWS, still love AWS, but we had to build a lot of that stuff ourselves.
Okay.
Said in another way, you can't go to AWS and purchase Fluid Compute off the shelf.
Right.
So you're using AWS as kind of like the hardware, as it were, but you're building a lot of the functionality on top of that stuff that others might try to get from AWS, but can't necessarily get from them, at least not yet.
Yeah, and we've seen this exact same thing play out in our build infrastructure as well. So yes, you can go run a bunch of builds on EC2, but we had done that for many, many years and found there were a lot of little optimizations we wanted to make it more efficient and more cost effective. And it's not like we set out with the goal, like, man, we really want to rebuild our build infrastructure and do something custom. It was more of a innovation was a necessity here. So we have a technical blog post that talks about this, but our internal build system is called Hive. And it's effectively, we outgrew EC2 based on, millions and millions and millions of builds, and ended up kind of building our own system on top of the underlying AWS primitives.
Cool.
So AWS is still great for like super reliable, fast, efficient cloud infrastructure. We're just trying to build, the right abstractions for developers so they can take the best advantage of that infrastructure.
Gotcha. So for the stuff in Fluid, how much of it is sort of transparent? Like I just build the next app and then I Fluid it and then it just works and I get those optimizations versus, okay, you're going to deploy this to Fluid. You've got to use some of these APIs to get some of the goodies.
Yeah, it's fully transparent. And this is kind of the beauty of the framework defined infrastructure model is you wrote a Next.js app or any framework app, and you had some kind of API, and it works on your local machine. You've got your API. Awesome. You deploy it to Vercel. We understand the output of the framework was an API. We convert it into a Vercel function, and you flip on the switch that says, yes, I would like to use Fluid Compute. You now have more cost-effective, more concurrent optimized infrastructure without having to write the infrastructure code yourself. It's still an output of the framework.
So what
we also have
do you support then?
Sorry, say it again.
What frameworks do you support then for Fluid?
Any framework that can run compute on Vercel. So any server rendered framework, any framework that allows APIs, or even, if you want to do, for example, a client Vite application that uses the Vercel functions API directory, which is a way to add server-side code to just a client-only app.
Mhm.
Those functions can also use Fluid as well. And also you can, maybe not as well known, but you can deploy Express apps to Vercel, or newer frameworks like Hono, which is like a backend Express replacement, and it also supports Python. So you can run Python APIs on Vercel too.
Very cool.
How about
Yeah.
Ruby on Rails?
Yeah, PHP and Laravel.
Yeah. It would be interesting. Not something that is kind of top of our list right now for Ruby or for PHP, but there
What?
are community libraries that do it. So some people have kind of hacked around it in the community, which I think is pretty interesting.
Nice. So what else should people know? What's going on at Vercel? It's always interesting to see what you guys are doing.
Yeah, so we talked about V0, we talked about the AI SDK, we talked about Next.js and some of our improvements there, talked about Vercel and Fluid Compute, we talked about the Flags SDK, we talked a little bit about ShadCN UI, which I think is interesting. ShadCN works at Vercel, so it's something that we are always investing in as well. And V0 natively understands ShadCN components,
Right.
as well as, kind of funnily enough, ChatGPT and Claude also, like their UI applications on the web, also understand ShadCN and can generate ShadCN components, which is pretty cool. So it's awesome to see that standardization there. I think that pretty much covers everything. I mean, we can talk about other bits if you would want, around Vercel's infrastructure and or other Next.js features, but that we've covered quite a bit of surface area.
Yeah. Well, we're kind of getting toward the end of our time too. If people want to connect, they have questions about Vercel or V0 or anything else we've asked about, how do they reach you or get help from other people at Vercel?
Yeah. If you want to reach out to me, please send me a message on X, Twitter. If you have feedback on any of our products, there should be a feedback button in the UI on every single one of our surfaces. If you want to just go directly there, that all gets read and routed to the right teams. So just know your feedback is heard. And you can also email me, lee@vercel.com, for those of you who
Awesome.
still like email.
All right.
I love
well,
email.
I don't,
I'll tell you one thing. We predominantly use Slack, and I keep losing things on Slack. Somebody sends a message in one of the channels. I'm like subscribed to like a million channels because of the type of role that I perform at the company.
Yeah.
And if something is sent on some channel and I didn't catch it when it was sent, there's a good chance that I will never catch it.
Yeah, I've had to get I've had to become a very skilled Slack sleuth. I don't know the right words, but I'm very good at navigating the mess of Slack channels now and staying on top of what I need to be on top of. Because yeah, as a company grows, there's just lots of information happening in real time in Slack.
Yep.
Well,
All right. Well,
ripe,
let's do
ripe
picks.
for machine learning.
Yes.
Yeah.
Here's a
Slack
summary of all the
GPT.
things. Here's a summary of all the things I should know that happened in Slack since the last time I checked.
Totally.
Yep. All right. Let's have Dan start us with picks. Dan, what are your picks?
I don't have that much. You know what? I'll mention just the one thing. So I think I picked this one before a while back. It's a podcast called Revolutions by Mike Duncan, the same guy that did the History of Rome podcast. I'm very much a history buff, and Revolutions is like him going through the big revolutions in history, starting from the English Revolution, the less well-known English Revolution with Oliver Cromwell, and then going to the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Mexican Revolution, the Russian Revolution, etc. And it's highly recommended and very interesting. But he's now doing something that's kind of out there. I mean, after the Russian Revolution, he got to the point where if he kept on talking about even more modern revolutions, it would stop being so much about history and being more about politics, I guess. So instead, what he did, he kind of invented his own revolution. He's talking about a revolution on Mars in the 24th century or 23rd or 24th century or something like that. So it's really interesting how he's inventing a revolution to talk about, and it's kind of like a science fiction story in a way, but it's very engaging, and I highly recommend it. Um, and so that would be, if you've not listened to any of that podcast, I would recommend to go back from the start. It's got hundreds of episodes. It's of course not the same type of podcast as ours. It's not a discussion. It's not an interview. It's all scripted. He basically reads out the script that he wrote, but he does a ton of research. It's highly engaging, very amusing, very informative. Again, highly recommended. And the new stuff is recommended as well. And that would be my pick.
Awesome. Steve, what are your picks?
All right. So before I get into the high point of every episode of the Dad Jokes of the Week, I'm going to do a shameless plug here in terms of a email I got through LinkedIn from somebody who's a listener. And I won't share his name to protect him from the abuse he would receive for somebody who likes my dad jokes. But he did say that, hey, I'm a longtime listener of JS Jabber and enjoy it very much, particularly your dad jokes. I have retold a few of them and got mostly eye rolling, but a few guffaws. So like, okay, that's good. We're making some good progress there. So now to the reason for that email, the dad jokes of the week. So recently I changed the voice, on my car's GPS. You can use the different accents and stuff. I changed it to male. So now it just says, it's around here somewhere. Keep driving. Oh, my dad joke drum roll's not working. Bumming me out here. Okay. So I was ordering a pizza the other day, and they asked me if I wanted to cut it into 4 or 8 slices. I said 4. There's no way I could eat 8. There we go. Right,
You kind of reminded me of the fact that I say that I don't care about the price of gas because I always pay $50.
Mm.
Gotcha. Sorry. Here, let me give you that. Oh, dang it. Drum joke's not working yet. Sorry, I tried to give you a drum joke. There we go. A little delayed. Sorry. We're back to Riverside again. The UI's, there's a little delay there. It's messing me up. So I got to get back on the train again.
You need to play the drum roll before you tell the joke, and then
There's enough of a lag there. I got to do it. So 2 more. So my favorite suit. I come up with a new superhero. Chuck's Marvel shirt that he's wearing today sort of inspired me. This. I don't know if he's part of the Marvel universe or maybe another one, but it's Typo Man because he rights all the wrongs. Right? That's WRITE, right? And then finally, I told my wife I wanted to be cremated. She made an appointment for Tuesday.
Well, there was the Monty Python Meaning of Life movie where they knock on his door and say you've signed to be an organ donor. We've come to collect.
Right. Always look on the bright side of life.
That's anyway. A different one though.
Right.
All right, I'm going to go in with my picks. I usually do a board game pick. I haven't played anything new lately. I'm going to pick one that I haven't picked in a while. So my wife and I went down to St. George, Utah for the Parade of Homes. We do this every year on the last weekend in February, basically. And my sister-in-law and her husband come, and they always bring the same game. And we really enjoy playing. It's called The Quacks of Quedlinburg. And what you're doing is you're basically brewing a potion. And if you get too many of the wrong element, the white elements in it, it'll blow up. And so you're trying to get as big a potion as you can, often with as many elements as possible, unique elements, without blowing up your pot. And then you get bonuses for playing it. I think we were playing with some of the extensions, but the base game is actually pretty good. let me see. I didn't look it up on Board Game Geek, so let me grab that real quick, and I can tell you what the it's got a board game weight of 1.94. So if you like a game that'll make you think, but it's not like super complicated, that's about where this clocks in. I think we played it an hour. Anyway, fun game. So I'm going to pick that. I'm also going to, and I'm just that guy sometimes. So we are on Riverside. It's been mentioned a few times. We were on StreamYard. I was having some issues with StreamYard, working things out to get the payments to work with them and things like that. And eventually they downgraded the account and deleted some of the episodes that we hadn't released yet.
Oh wow.
And so, yeah. Caveat emptor, if you're going to go use StreamYard, they have a great tool, but they might just stab you in the kidney. So anyway, the other
Deleting
thing, though,
content is a big no-no. I mean,
yeah. And I tried to work with them. I tried to figure out how to get it, and they just came back and said we deleted it. So anyway, yeah. So if you're going to do this kind of a thing, just be aware we've never had that issue with Riverside. I did go through a bit of a process just talking to Riverside, and the process was them showing me all the things it does now, and it does like all of the things that I had wished it had done before. It basically does now. You can actually edit your episodes in Riverside,
Ooh.
and it uses AI to clean up a bunch of stuff. Automatically generates your transcripts. It'll write you show notes. All the things that I've either been paying for other systems to do or wishing that I had a system to do. It does all those things. So I'm going to pick Riverside. Riverside is not cheap either, but anyway, it's awesome.
anything's
It does,
better than some getting your episodes deleted.
yeah. So yeah, we lost a couple. I think we lost more on Ruby Rogues than we did on JavaScript Jabber, but we may have to reach out to a couple people and say, hey, they deleted it. We're going to re-record it. But yeah, I'm delighted to be on Riverside, and apparently it's an Israeli company, which is also cool.
Hmm.
I don't know that I care a ton where any company I use is based, unless it just doesn't work
I'm
for
kind
some
of
reason.
curious because it was streamed live, so it's on YouTube, it's on X.
Oh
Can't you?
yes, we could get them that way. That's a good. Here we go, troubleshooting live on JavaScript Jabber. Yeah, we should be able to pull them off of YouTube because they're on the channel for the network, and so we can download them off of there. You just saved us a little work. Thanks, Dan. Besides that,
I still remember that episode that we did with pressing the record button. Remember
done
that
that.
one?
Oh,
once or twice.
I've done
Yeah.
that before. Yeah, not fun.
That's a mistake you only make a couple of times, and then you're
Very
all
first
right.
podcast
We'll let
episode
Lee
I
throw out some picks. Lee, you
very
have some
first
picks?
podcast episode I ever did. I did that and had to re-record it. The guy was gracious enough to re-record it with me.
Yep.
Never forget that.
By the way, as an interesting pick, we now use, for some reason, Google Meet at work instead of Zoom, which is not necessarily what I would have chosen, but they have a good feature, which is you can pre-configure the session to be recorded because you never remember to press
Mhm.
record in real time.
Yep.
So it's
Yeah.
it's one thing that I do now when it's sessions that I schedule that I know need to be recorded.
Yep. I think Lee needs to run. Do you have anything you want to throw out real quick?
I'll give a shout out to Zed, my code editor. I mentioned it a little bit in the podcast, but it's been a joy to use, and they're shipping tons of good improvements. So big fan.
All right, good deal. Well, thanks again for coming.
Of course.
So much interesting stuff going on. You're right in the
Yeah,
middle
thank
of
you
it.
for having me.
All right, we'll wrap it up here, folks. And until next time, max out.
Adios.
Bye.
Thank you.
All right, hang in there for. Oh, he